Making Space for Art and Culture. How do consultants and architects approach working with communities, arts organizations, and city builders to successfully develop or redevelop new cultural spaces? What are the true foundations of arts infrastructure, and what's next in the future of cultural planning? Hello, and welcome to the 7th episode of At the Mic, a podcast brought to you by Arts Consultants Canada, l'Association des consultants canadiens en art. In this edition of At the Mic, we bring you a conversation about some essential contemporary approaches to imagining and reimagining cultural spaces. Our guests, Sabrina Richard and moderator Christina Bagatavicius, will share some of their wisdom gleaned from 20 years of experience. They are the co-founders of the Bespoke Collective, a forward-looking creative consultancy that is committed to redefining how culture and civic life bring people together. ACCA acknowledges the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for this podcast series. Nous remercions le Conseil des Arts du Canada pour son soutien à cette série de balados. Sabrina Richard is the Director of Research and Planning at Bespoke Collective. An architect by training and cultural planner by profession, Sabrina has led numerous large-scale and complex architectural and cultural planning projects across Canada and internationally, spanning needs assessment, feasibility studies, strategic planning, and community engagement. She is dedicated to the realization of thoughtful, dynamic, and meaningful cultural spaces enriched by innovative design, public engagement, community activation, and inclusive consultation. Sabrina is also a published author, designer, and strategist focused on building a more equitable, inclusive, and resilient arts and culture ecosystem. Some of her recent projects include support for Indigenous fashion arts, the New Orleans Triennial of Art, and the public art strategy for the Downsview Lands development. As the principal of Bespoke, Christina Bagatavicius believes in forward-looking cultural programming, uplifting public engagement processes, and communications that capture the hearts and minds of a wider public. She collaborates with inspiring and creative clients who are committed to making lasting positive change. Christina brings over 15 years of international experience working with renowned culture and city building projects. Prior to launching Bespoke, she was the curator and head of interpretation at the Tate in London, where she shaped the visitor experience for a world-leading art museum. During her time as project director at Bruce Mau Design, she worked with a global roster of creative clients, from the Oprah Winfrey Network to the Liverpool Biennial. And now, here are Sabrina Richard and Christina Bagatavicius.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christina Bagatavicius, and I'm joined here today with Sabrina Richard, who, for those of you who don't know us, is an incredible cultural planner, but also a long-term friend collaborator. So I'm delighted to kind of be able to have an informal conversation together today about reimagining creative spaces. And I thought it would be really fun to kind of, because we have such a long history together, Sabrina, and we've known each other over a decade, I thought it might be fun to kind of go back to how we first met when we were talking about cultural planning. I think it was like 13 years ago. Actually, I was looking on the years and the work over that time. And I remember when you initially started your practice, it was very rooted in architecture. I'd love to hear a little about your experience working on culture spaces and planning all those many years ago, and why you ended up pivoting to where you are now. It'd be really cool to hear a little bit of that journey. I think it sets up a really nice context, for the connection between the built environment and your cultural lens as well.
Thanks, Christina. It's so great to be talking with you. We talk a lot, but this is a nice time for us to remember all the things that we've done together. I think for me, starting off, I studied architecture at McGill and then later at U of T. And I think my first project was working on a kind of cultural event. It was working for the 2020 Olympics. I had moved to London from Toronto to do that work. And it was like my first experience working on a project that really foregrounded culture and spaces for culture. And then when I returned to Canada, I was really looking for a firm that worked on cultural spaces. And I ended up working for a small firm run by Michael Lundholm, who was deeply involved in the Super Build program. And I think for those of us that remember, Super Build was this incredible $20 billion infrastructure program for Ontario. And it was announced just after the millennium. And it was really, it was primarily for roads and bridges and, important things like that. But it also funded these new cultural spaces. So the ROM, the AGO, the Royal Conservatory, the National Ballet School, all of these, the list goes on and on. They all came out of that kind of super build time. And this cultural renaissance for architecture and spaces dedicated to arts and culture, that was all happening while I was in architecture school at U of T. So I think seeing that investment made me think that, capital A architecture was a really important resource for arts and culture to thrive. So, working in the field, working at Lundholm Associates, I was working with arts and culture institutions. We were doing feasibility studies and needs assessments and, design development. And then, once you peel back the curtain and you see how things really happen, you really see how important partnerships are and communities and leaders, artists, how much they make those spaces thrive and how much they make those projects really meaningful. So I was expanding my thinking, beyond just the tangible built environment and thinking about, what is that kind of messy, dynamic world of the intangible culture that involves people and people reimagining spaces. And then this is, I think, is it 2011? That's when you and I meet. And we start talking about what it would be like to form a new kind of firm. And then we win a project together with some incredible collaborators for the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. And that project was kind of perfect. Like it was a hybrid cultural space. It was for a museum in the lobby of a performing arts center. It was a partnership between two institutions that were in different disciplines. And it was celebrating an art form that you don't typically include in contemporary art. Songwriting is not spoken about usually as much. And, I think that kind of solidified that, what we were interested in and this idea of how important cultural spaces are and thinking about them more broadly. That was the project that really started off. Do you remember that project many years ago and how we started working together on it?
Yeah, I certainly do. It feels like just yesterday when there was a lot more energy. But similar to you, I mean, I also started my career in London, and at that point, I was working at the Tate, and it was such a specific typology of a cultural space. It had so many kind of specific constraints in terms of the types of experiences and the expectations of that kind of built environment when you step into it. So I think when I came back to Canada, I had an appetite for that kind of a hybrid space that you're describing, and the Songwriters was kind of perfect because it just made those interesting and unexpected connections across culture. And while that I know I appreciate the value of like specific disciplines and types of spaces that are ideally suited to different art forms, at the same time, there's something to be learned by breaking through silos and making unexpected connections for cultural experiences, especially I think when you think about audiences and what an audience's experience is like and what they're looking for and how, in their day-to-day rhythm of life, they don't make the kind of same distinctions we do as art consultants working in that space. And I remember that Songwriters Hall of Fame is just like a real moment of excitement and coming together and thinking about new possibilities. And sadly, it didn't come to be realized, which can be the case with these kinds of planning projects. But there's definitely some really great learnings in that. And I think that kind of spirit of thinking broadly and expansively about culture informs our work, to this point as well. So I kind of appreciate that stepping stone as I think about it. Now, I know like the main topic of today is really getting into this idea of reimagining what a creative space is. I wonder if we should start with the topic by discussing and, checking in with you on what does that even mean to you from your perspective, from your standpoint, from the experiences that you bring?
Yes. We talk a lot about the ways that culture and creativity have been expanding. We mentioned those kind of practices that weren't necessarily included in capital A art, but also hybrid forms, new forms of creativity. And I think I've always been really interested in not only what gets counted under kind of creativity, but also who gets included in those spaces and whose work is celebrated as arts and culture. So, I mean, that's what's so wonderful about working in this time. We have both expanded practice, but then that also means expanded spaces to support that practice. So, we've looked at underused spaces, we've looked at underappreciated spaces. And I think while they definitely have challenges, it's the tensions in those spaces that make them interesting and allow artists to bring out these kind of new possibilities. So I think the project that kind of sums that up and really makes me think about how that's really the future of where cultural spaces are going is our Bentway project, which when we started didn't even have a name. It was just being reimagined by Ken Greenberg and the Matthews. And at the time that we were talking about all the incredible things that could happen under the Gardner, if you remember, the city was talking about tearing down the Gardner Expressway. So we were building a project that may not even be there if certain people had their way. And I know that, I mean, I remember how much you worked on creating a different narrative for that space.
It's so funny now because there's so much positivity around the space, and it really feels of its time to repurpose existing public infrastructure in innovative ways. But when we first stepped into the project, there was this enormous fear, I think, around taking something that was so divisive and cutting a city off from its waterfront and, building cultural capacity underneath it. It was that idea of like, does the scar run too deep in the city psychologically? Could people ever get past the negative connotations of that kind of a space? And also acknowledging like we don't have the luxury anymore of purpose built everywhere, when we're thinking about the built environment too. So,
That's a very good point.
like we have to be innovative. We have to work with what we have and like find new structures and systems. And so from a narrative standpoint, which you're bringing up, I think like one of the big things we worked on and considered was how do you flip the narrative on public perceptions in an authentic and meaningful way? Like, how do you build support for the possibility of a new way of looking at a forgotten space? It's like enormously exciting because it's unknown, but also the unknownness feels risky. And people, maybe take a little longer to understand what the possibilities are and to get excited about them. So I think that was like a real opportunity in this project for us to figure out what it means to share a kind of scale of possibility that's really big, that's hard to wrap your hands around, and to garner that kind of excitement and support by sharing, and by co-creating and by having conversations. And I think that's like a really critical piece you can't, take away from a space.
It's interesting. That project, there actually wasn't a lot of architectural design to be done in that project. I mean, we worked with incredible landscape architects who obviously helped to create a kind of platform and definitely some dedicated spaces. But a lot of it was about kind of reimagining, working interdisciplinarity, like working with interdisciplinarity, working with intersectionality, bringing in like curators and exhibition designers and filmmakers and writers who we could work with and kind of think, you have this incredibly tall, incredibly narrow, incredibly windy space that's dark-ish. Doesn't turn out to be that dark, actually, in reality, but there was a perception of it being like dark. And thinking about all the things it could be. And I remember one of the highlights for that project for me was assembling a jury of incredible thinkers from across Toronto, philosophers, artists, community leaders from various parts of like walks of life, people who were kind of new Canadians, people who were living outside the GTA, and bringing all that knowledge together and those worldviews together to imagine a space that was not going to have a lot of architecture, but was going to have a lot of people populating it. And that was really special, I think. When I think back about those moments, about how that project formed, it's those people and those conversations that made it um, particularly exciting.
Is there a life lesson in particular? I think you're describing almost the who is this for? Who should be a part of this? And like building that kind of real sensibility of public as the starting point, I think, which is like really exciting. And I think the interdisciplinarity and the intersectionality of that jury that you created, um, that needs to happen, and it doesn't happen often enough even now, in terms of how we do consultation, engagement, and understanding of, who a space is serving, working with, the cultural planners, the artists, the residents, the people that live around and are at the Dino City. I wonder if there's any other life lessons for you from the project, that you would want to share working on that kind of public space.
the projects that we work on, I think just based by the fact that they're in culture, a lot of them are kind of imagining new spaces. There's not always a particular client who's going to pay for it all. There's not always enough funding to have the entire project realized in one go. I mean, the Bentway, we're very lucky to have philanthropy behind it, but even with that, we still needed to kind of bring the city along with us. So I think for me, as someone who works in cultural planning, I also needed that positive, hopeful narrative to fight the pessimism that was kind of pervasive around, is this possible? Should we be investing in the arts this way? There's always going to be multiple kind of disciplines and causes that need attention. And, at that time, many people in the downtown core saw the Gardner as a structure that was really just supporting commuters, maybe even at the expense of the quality of their life. And I had some misgivings about the Gardner myself, having grown up in Toronto and always thinking of it as you said, like a barrier to the incredible waterfront. So I think that power of that narrative and how that opens up both the creativity of the people in the city, but even the creativity of the people working on the team was really important to me. And, once we were allowed to kind of open up our imaginations and think about what that investment could do, that's when I was like, this is the only way to move a project forward.
I think so too. And I think another one of the challenges for a new typology of cultural or public space is just how do you give people a sense of the future when it's not there to see? And that was something I think we collaborated on a lot that was interesting. And we needed to move past like renderings and maps and just like little, digital widgets. Like,
Totally.
you are
But
here.
those are all the things that architects have. Like, they can only show you a model.
But even then, it's like when it's an empty, pristine 3D model you're walking through, and I've worked on exhibitions where, the architects walk you through the space. It often doesn't give you the feeling, the energy, the kind of the vitality of creativity, as a way of communicating. And so I think if we as cultural consultants can't get that, from these kinds of renderings, then what hope can we have for sharing it with people who don't have as much background and context, for the work we're doing? And so I think one element of that project, maybe not directly tied to public space, but that I think is important to highlight is just the ways in which we share visions, in compelling ways and make them come to life. And we shared a lot of stories. We had
Absolutely.
conversations. We did video pieces. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the elements, like for you, that that sort of helped to convey that message.
Yeah, I mean, that project was not about like this one big bang. It was about many little pieces that kind of showed the possibility. So we painted the structures underneath the Gardner to show how they were, while they were functional, they were these incredible forms. They were monumental. We hired artists to do pieces around the city about the possibility of the Gardner, and at that time, the Bentway. And, we worked with a filmmaker, this incredible documentary filmmaker, Gabby Conte, who created, a film piece that talked about what the city could do in this space. We held a naming jury. We held a naming campaign that brought the city into the project. That was obviously like, there's a great story behind the naming campaign as well. And, we had many conversations, both at large scales, like, online and with the city, but we also had intimate conversations with, like, facilitated by the magazine Spacing, where we were able to kind of meet in a room with a number of urban planners and like young urbanists who were really excited about the possibility. And like their ideas just made the project richer. So it was about those kind of like small acts, those small movements that kind of culminated in this, both in scale, but also an impact project.
Yeah, I think that naming piece is really interesting too. And maybe we don't necessarily think about it in terms of the types of spaces and planning spaces, but what you call something deeply impacts how you relate to it and how you invite people into it. So I think for us, when we were early days in the planning process, and there wasn't cultural programming yet. There weren't those kind of like typical anchors that people could feed into. And so coming together to talk about what we could name a new type of public space, started to establish, I feel like, a bit of a relationship to what that space could be in conversation with the public, which was really interesting. And And there was a bit of scandal around the naming too, which I think is funny. But I mean, I thought it was pretty
You
incredible
have
for
to
those.
share the story. It's such a great story.
Well, we, as Sabrina, you mentioned, we had this big campaign. We had naming brainstorm parties. We had digital toolkits with people submitting names. We had like over 900 names submitted. We had this incredible jury that was intergenerational, intersectional, creating a short list. And then we put it up for daily voting for members of the public for 2 weeks, which I think you were inspired by basketball. Was that the basketball voting?
Yeah, there were a number of kind of naming for arenas and sports around. So, and as a sports fan, I was like, okay, this brings the people together.
So we had this, people were voting daily and they were supporting their name, and you could see in real time on the screen which names were most popular out of the short list the jury had selected. And it felt like it was going so smoothly. There was so much energy. There was people engaged. You know what I mean? There was a following. There was conversation. And then I believe, and I don't know why, but we like set up, I think, the calculation and the closing of the voting at midnight. Like it was the witching hour of the evening. And then in the final moments, some urban planning maverick, I can only imagine today, decided to hack in their favorite name and repeatedly broke into our digital system to try to skew the voting. So there's like a kind of radical shift that happened in the last hour, I think, of the voting session, which at the time we were absolutely mortified about and quickly troubleshooting as quickly as we could. And then the project, of course, made national news on the back of our naming campaign getting hacked. It was at the same time as the kind of Bodie McBoatface naming process in the UK as well. So there was
Yes.
all of that kind of like
We were in good company. People were so passionate about the naming of this public space. They went after it.
That's the thing when I share the story now, or when I hear people talking about it from the Bentley now, I think I am proud of the fact, that we worked on a project where people cared enough. You know what I mean? That they pulled their JavaScript or their code or whatever they were doing, and they hacked into the system to try to kind of lean into a name that they were most passionate about. So while I appreciate people following like rules and structures that are set out in processes, it was really cool to see that kind of enthusiasm and that level of intensity, around where we landed with the Bentway. That's kind of a funny little snippet of a story.
I love that.
So I guess coming back to the original question, which is this kind of open thinking around reimagining creative spaces, I'm curious to know, you've worked on so many projects over the years. Is there a particular project for you that really stands out, when you're thinking about that you'd share for us and kind of give us a little bit of context about why it's important to you?
I've been thinking about this, and I realized that I come back to quite a bit some of the work that we did with the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. In particular, the development of their campus in North Lawndale, which, if you know, Chicago is the west side of the city. This is a community that's primarily African American. It's really underserved when it comes to cultural spaces, but it has these incredible resources, intangible resources that just really need investment. This is actually an area that Obama proposed would be the site of his presidential library. And unfortunately, that proposal went to another community. But North Lawndale is really special. And it was the site where SAIC decided that they wanted to build a kind of outport campus specifically about engaging local arts communities with local communities with arts. So our role was to kind of support that visioning, that engagement between the school and community leaders. And also we helped design this kind of public art initiative to kick off the redevelopment. So we worked on a couple of different stages of this project with, at the time, Dean Paul Kofi and his Office of Engagement. So for me, that project, it has, first of all, it really hits the architectural geek in me. It has this incredible architectural history background. It's the site of the former Sears and Roebuck building that prefabricated so many houses in the early 20th century that kind of spread across North America. It's this incredible partnership between an art education institution and this really dynamic community and residents. It had all these ambitions for capacity building programming with artist residencies and workshops and, putting in infrastructure and tools for youth. And then there was even a component which, I really love, and I remember when it was developing, where Sweetwater Foundation was building a community garden on the disused rail space just behind the site of the project. And that organization, Sweetwater, they would go on to win a MacArthur Genius Grant for their work in urban agriculture. So is this like there are all these incredible people with fantastic ideas working on that project, and I think I'm just proud to have even just been a small part of it. I know for you, you worked on the broader campus plan for SAIC, and I always wanted to ask you, like, what does it feel like to see just that part of the project happen out of that larger puzzle that you helped put together?
It's really surreal because in those early campus planning, strategic planning days, it's kind of such a bird's eye view of what's going on that it's really just like network dots on a map of possibilities. And so at the time, I was working with Bruce Design, and they had collaborated with Canon and Yazdani architects, and they were working on the master planning process. And obviously, Chicago is a dense city. They're located right in the loop as well. So the kind of core campus was in this sought after high piece of real estate. And so it's like, how do you grow and evolve, within that kind of a space? I think one of the things actually that was most remarkable about the campus planning piece early days was the commitment to engage students in the process was really fantastic. And there was like an ethos and a spirit of community engagement at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago that I've always appreciated working with them. And I remember kind of really set the stage when we first started this work. I mean, so we did like all the classic things you do, talking, doing interviews, connecting with core stakeholders and those kinds of things. But one of the more unexpected components is we hosted, it's like a 300 to 400 person, consultation session for students in their ballroom, exploring all of the possibilities of what the campus could mean for them and what the opportunities were and needs were from a student perspective. And we tried to design the activities in a really creative way, leaning into those artistic practices. So there was sketching and mapping and kind of, thinking about, as an art student, what would resonate with you as a way of engaging in this kind of topic. So I think that kind of making, an urban planning or a cultural planning project more accessible and more open and welcoming, was a critical piece of working on that master plan early days. And for me, it's something that's it continues to be one of the most important things that I think about every time I step into a project. It's just that, how do we share this, like with generosity, in a way that's welcoming, in a way that's respectful, in a way that's thinking about the who and then putting that at the center, and not as an afterthought, which you don't want it to be transactional. This is kind of a lifelong cycle that we're, these spaces have, lifetimes and legacies that they leave. And so it's so critical that that we kind of share and we welcome and we really listen to. I think in working with you when we've done consultation, Sabrina, I've always appreciated, the way in which you've leaned into deep listening as a kind of critical metric for engagement. It doesn't have to be, like an elaborate 6-step sketching process, charrette, you know what I mean, to get somewhere. It's like, can you make space to really just listen and be responsive to what you're hearing and to kind of make connections across conversations? So I've always appreciated that. When you do this work, I'm curious about the kind of sensitivity around the local specificity and how you negotiate being an outside consultant who's kind of gently stepping into a neighborhood and or always, a community as well. At what point do you feel like the planning process work should also be taken by somebody local? And how do you navigate that as a consultant? I'm curious. I think people will be curious to know.
I mean, I think the local community always needs to be involved from the very beginning. So, they're the ones that hold the expertise, the specificity of their own site, the history, the resources, the relationships. So ideally, there really should never be like a handoff period where, as a consultant, you're kind of giving the work that you've done to other people who will steer it. They really need to be part of that process from the beginning. And, the reality is I am almost always outside the neighborhood, the community, the organization that I work with. And that's a position of power and trust. Like, I need to not take that lightly. And, I tap into a number of skills. I don't know if you know this, but in my university days, many moons ago, I worked as a crisis counselor. So I actually got training in active listening and deep listening and how to contribute to a conversation without actually being in the conversation. And I rely on those skills so often, especially when we're facilitating processes or working with partnerships. And I'm always really conscious of not taking up too much space, supporting key players. And I think of my experience as like a resource, but I'm not the final decision maker. This is something that the key participants, including the local community, need to take on. So that's sort of how I negotiate and maybe even justify or, you know, there's a certain amount of conceit to stepping in as a consultant with our role, but that's how I kind of try to operate in that space.
I think I did know about that, those early days.
Oh,
But I thought you were going to talk about
yes.
some of your other hobbies, which I will keep mysterious. um,
Okay.
I've got I've got a last question for you, and I think like just wanting to kind of touch base a little on new and emerging practices in particular when we think about the culture sector and space and how that's negotiated. And so I know one kind of typology we've both been working on recently are biennials, cultural festivals, often within the visual arts or within fashion, that are actively reframing what a cultural space means and what it can do in new and unexpected ways. Increasingly, they're kind of, crawling their feelers out into entire cities and neighborhoods. I'd love for you to talk a bit about some of our work on the Toronto Biennial of Arts. And then we also worked on an impact report for Prospect, the Triennial in New Orleans. So I'm curious to hear about when we think about that kind of typology, festival, biennial, triennial, how do these projects make you think about what a creative space is today and how we should define it?
I mean, this is particularly interesting, especially like I moved from collection-based spaces like museums and very much about their brick and mortar, and now we're working with organizations and projects that have no permanent space. So everything they do is temporary, and really what they're working with is the entire city at that scale. So they're not only creating a space for creativity and culture, but they're also retelling the story of that city through these kind of temporary acts. Um, so when we're working with biennials, we're frequently helping them think about and find these kind of forgotten, neglected spaces. We're thinking about partnerships across disciplines, across boundaries, and the ways that what they're doing can kind of knit together people and neighborhoods, sometimes across these historic divides. I always think about, for example, when we work with Prospect in the latest iteration of P5, Prospect was formed after Katrina as a way of both giving artists a platform, but also helping the city regenerate some of that tourism that's really important to the economic like lifeblood of New Orleans. And so Prospect holds this kind of multiple role. They're trying to support their city. They're giving opportunities to artists. They're highlighting the African American traditions and artists of their city. And they're also trying to generate tourism dollars. And I think about, and yet they're still very brave in what they do. So, one thing that really stands out for me about that project is when they invited Simone Lee, incredible artist, to install Sentinel, also called Mamiwata, at the base of the pedestal that once held the monument to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And this was a temporary act. That piece was then deinstalled to make space for other works that kind of questioned and talked about the history of the city. But when we interviewed people for the impact report, they talked about how that kind of temporary act creates this forever change, this long-standing kind of new cultural memory in New Orleans as a city. So, it does make me think about how creative space is actually about creating a kind of cultural memory that changes the perception or use of a space moving forward. And I'm really interested in that idea of what is the impact of doing something that's temporary and how can we hold a kind of space in our memories about culture and activation. I mean, the Toronto Biennial does many of these kind of things like in Toronto, and I know they're really thinking of the city of Toronto as kind of one of their partners or a different kind of ecosystem with which to work. Um, can you think of ways that the biennial has changed how people think about Toronto and how that work is kind of reformulating the narrative of that city?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Toronto Biennial, which is a project we've been lucky enough to work on, I feel like maybe 5 or 6 years. They've done such a great job of tapping into like the rootedness of Toronto and the cultural diversity of the city, and programming in such a way that you're bringing together specific conversations that could only happen within the context of this city and this neighborhood. So I really loved the way they disperse their programming in some expected but also unexpected spaces. And then I think, the two iterations were in relationship to the water. And so renegotiating our relationship to the waterfront and what that means and our commitments to that. And in particular, also the Indigenous land treaties and Indigenous leadership currently, at play, and kind of acknowledging the importance of that from day to day, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty, and inviting us into a deeper understanding in terms of how we connect with this land, how we relate to it, how we live on it, using art, I think, and culture. And this kind of biennial is a catalyst to really hold fantastic conversations. And I think we should put this in the kind of links. But there's an incredible book that the Toronto Biennial of Art and Jumblies Theatre produced together about, land treaties, land acknowledgements in Toronto, and understanding the land we're standing on, and having respect and understanding for that. And I feel like that's such a wonderful, richer kind of conversation to bring in for us to understand. I also loved, they worked with Ange Loft on an Indigenous context brief to set the stage for the curatorial framework early days. And I thought that that's really been important, because we need to always start with, the specificity of where we are for these kinds of conversations before we can program, before we can find the spaces. That's like the fundamental anchor. And they did a really kind of thoughtful job of sharing knowledge and building the knowledge and reminding us and of the importance of that as an integral part of any kind of cultural planning process. So I feel like TBA has done an incredible job of doing that, and I'm so grateful to have worked on it with them, but also to have seen them grow and continue to expand and continue to kind of support learning in the city across different generations. And it's absolutely free programming too. I think that's one thing to highlight with a biennial or a triennial, that model of accessibility to changes. It's accessibility in a familiar place in your neighborhood often. So you can have these smaller conversations that you can't do when you kind of intentionally walk into a more, cultural institution legacy type space. So that was a little long-winded, but I think getting at some of what I wanted to say about TVA, for sure. Okay, well, Sabrina, I know, I mean, we were chatting and I could actually literally do this with you all day. I feel like it's kind of how we work together at any rate. But I have a proper wrap up question I have in mind I'd love to ask you, which is just, as a consultant working on these long term cultural space projects, I know sometimes they can go on for decades. What does it feel like from your standpoint to contribute to a discrete part of a project that lives on after you? I'd be curious to know that.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I'll be honest, it's definitely challenging. So, to do this work, you get really passionate about your contribution and what's going to happen. And that passion obviously spills over into your life and it helps, define the direction of your work. And then when your part of the project is done, you move on, but also the project moves on in its own way, in its own direction. And that's right. That's what should happen. And we do try to keep in touch with clients. And, sometimes if we're lucky, we're brought back to do future phases of work. But as you said, like a lot of times these projects either they get stalled, they don't materialize, the funding doesn't happen, or people move on potentially in a direction that were not necessarily supporting, and you have to kind of just manage that. Um, I mean, I think if I were honest, that would be the one thing that would make me reconsider being a consultant, that need to kind of stay on a project and see it through and nurture it for a longer period of time. But I think we're also really lucky because, um, you know, we definitely get to see so many different kinds of projects, work with so many different kinds of people, that I think that outweighs that feeling of like, I just need to let go and let it be without me. So at least that's what I tell myself at this moment in time. And what's great about working with sort of spaces as well, that they are, even though they feel long lasting, they are always changing. And, no one person or, one consultant, one organization is ever going to be able to determine what happens to a space, especially a space as dynamic as like, a culture space, a museum, a gallery, or even a part of a city for very long. So what do they say? Hold on tightly, let go lightly.
It's great. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It's been really nice to chat in a more formal way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christina. And we don't usually have these kind of conversations where we unpack our work this way. So this is it's amazing. I'm going to remember this conversation, not the actual work, is what will happen.
And that wraps up our 7th edition of At the Mic, a podcast of Arts Consultants Canada. For information on ACCA and our members, please check us out online at artsconsultants.ca. To send us feedback or questions on anything you hear in this podcast series, please email us at podcast@artsconsultants.ca. And remember to check our show notes in this podcast for links mentioned during the program. Et notez bien que quelques épisodes sont en français et nous offrons accès à un service de traduction de ne rien manquer. Thank you so much for joining us on At the Mic. Remember to subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Until next time, and thanks again for listening. À la prochaine.